Hello and welcome to this webinar on preventing sexual harassment. Are you doing enough? Hosted by Saeem. I'm Kate Smith from Focal Point Training and Consultancy. I'm your host for today and will be taking you through the session. As people continue to join us, I'll just introduce our panel as well. So we have Tilly Tilbrook, who is Director at Integrated Ecological Solutions Limited. And joining us too, we'll have Emma Hatchett, Head of Nature Services at WSP UK Limited. What we'll be covering today, I will show you in a second. What I'll talk about first is the format for the session. So I'm going to be talking you through some stats and the law. Then we'll have some time for questions to the panel. So do use the Q&A function to ask questions. We might cover them as we go. We have Sarah from Saeem helping behind the scenes. So she will help with those questions. And also, if you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat function. And Sarah will try to help you with that. If we have, we'll have time for some questions, as I said. If we don't have time to go through them all, we'll take them away and come back to you. And we'll include answers in the pack that we'll circulate after this. Also, because I'm going through quite a lot of stats and things, we'll send you links to any of the studies that we're referencing here. So I think that's everything in terms of format. Let me talk you through what we're going to be covering today. First of all, it's what the law says about sexual harassment, what surveys tell us is happening, how to take a preventative approach, why everyone needs to play their part, and assessing your manager's understanding and confidence. Before we start, I wanted to just give you a signpost towards these organisations. Sometimes if we haven't recognised our own experience as being sexual harassment or sexual violence and we go into this kind of conversation, it can be a bit triggering. So up front, I just wanted to give you access to those. Do feel free to take a photograph of any of these slides, but as I said, they will be circulated as well. So if you or anyone else might benefit from support, there's good places to go. And that's something we always mention in our sessions because we're all real people living real lives. Okay, let's get straight to it then. The Equality Act 2010 defines sexual harassment as unwanted conduct of a sexual nature, which has the purpose or effect of violating someone's dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment for them. Now, each word in that earns its place. So particularly, you might look at purpose or effect. I think we're talking about it doesn't matter if it was on purpose. If it has the effect, it still counts. We're going to go quite a lot into what we mean by the environment as well. Some examples of behaviour that could constitute sexual harassment are indecent or suggestive remarks, questions, jokes, or suggestions about a colleague's sex life, the display of pornography in the workplace, including online, unwelcome and inappropriate touching, hugging, or kissing, and requests or demands for sexual favours. It's important to note that a perpetrator's claim that a comment or action was meant in jest or as a compliment is not a defence. So that's often a myth around sexual harassment and something that we discuss when we, as Focal Point, run workshops for organisations, just get out some of these myths really early on. And harassment doesn't have to be directed at the person complaining about it. So, for example, displaying pornography in a work environment or sexual comments directed at someone else can still create a degrading, intimidating, or hostile working environment, even if they are not the intended object of the comments. I think it's really worth getting these myths out of the way at the beginning. It's also harassment to treat someone less favourably because they have rejected or submitted to unwanted sexual conduct. So that's also within this definition. 3 other myths that we go through in our workshops. A single act can constitute harassment. Harassment, the term gives the idea that something is ongoing, but it needn't be. and a more junior person can be deemed to have sexually harassed a more senior person. There is a power relationship in this, but it's not always obvious. Also, an allegation of sexual harassment can be made in relation to any working environment, not just in work hours on a work site. And we're going to come on to some more information about that. So I hope that's helpful in setting the scene as what we mean by sexual harassment. And I'll go a little broader into that later on. The second part of the legal information I want to share with you today is the Worker Protection Act, which came into force in the UK in October 24, so 12 months ago. This is quite a timely moment to say, right, what has happened since that came in? Well, it moves us from a culture of redress to one of prevention, which basically means there's a new duty on employers to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment. It also means that where they found not to have done that, employment tribunals have the power to uplift compensation by up to 25%. There is information now from the Equality and Human Rights Commission on what those reasonable steps are. I'll go into a little bit more detail later on that, but just as a guidance, policies, regular training, not just one-off training for staff, ensuring people feel able to speak up on inappropriate behaviour and that it will be acted on. And addressing issues such as power imbalances and lack of equality, which are drivers. If the Act is breached, then two things could happen. Compensation may be greater than it was, and there could be enforced action from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. So that could be conducting investigations and just forcing them to do certain things. This did happen with McDonald's not very long ago. You may have seen that in the news. What has happened in the last year then? The first case has come through and there was a 30-case settlement. That's because there hadn't been reasonable steps by the organisation to prevent sexual harassment. And there have been more cases referred to the Employee and Employer Advice Service. Why that might be happening, it could be that there's more awareness around what sexual harassment is. I think we'll all agree there's a lot in the news about this over the last year or two, if not 15 years or so in the making. So this is still a very live issue. Maybe people are feeling more able to speak up. I think it's worth noting that when we come to the stats in more detail about who speaks up, what you're seeing come through your organisation is probably not the entirety of what's happening. And of course, what you can talk about in your organisation won't be everything that's happening either. So a lot of people might be in the dark about what is happening and perhaps about what is acceptable too. Things we therefore need to think about are what we can be doing within our organisations and working with the organisations that we partner with or perhaps provide for to make sure that sexual harassment isn't happening in the first place. And how do we equip our people, especially our managers, so that they feel confident in what they need to do to prevent it happening, but also deal with it when it arises. Okay, so I'm going to quickly move us on to some studies which talk about the experiences of sexual harassment at work. Most common reported behaviours in the last 12 months in the workplace. This is according to the 2020 Sexual Harassment Survey by the Government Equalities Office. This was a huge survey, over 12,000 people responded, and it took place in May to July 2019. So this was actually pre-pandemic. We'll come on to some post-pandemic stuff later on. I wonder if you'd guess what these are. So the most common reported behaviours were sexual jokes, unwelcome staring or looks, offensive materials, unwanted sexual, non-sexual touching, and sexual comments. So that's interesting there. You've got non-sexual touching in there as well, because it can still count as sexual harassment. 1 in 20 people say they have experienced many behaviours within the workplace within the last year. This is not just over your career. So moving forward, who is this happening to? Now, at this point, I think Sarah's going to help me with a poll. So you should see on your screen now. I wonder if you would guess what percentage of women experiencing sexual harassment in the last 12 months, what that percentage was in the workplace. So you have choices 27, 36, or 31, or 51%. And a second question should be showing you on your screen as well. What percentage of men experience sexual harassment in the last 12 months? First for women experiencing it, the second for men experiencing it. I'm just going to wait for those results to come in. Okay, thank you very much. Good to know you're there, just to say. We have absolutely right on the first question. Let's have a look. So the majority of people voting, let me get back onto the screen, women were significantly more likely to have experienced any form of sexual harassment in the last 12 months than men. 51% of women experienced sexual harassment in the last 12 months. And 34% of men reported to the survey, not reporting to work, experiencing sexual harassment in the last 12 months. We will put the link, as I said, in the chat, in the notes when we circulate the pack, so you can dig a little bit more into this. There is a career length statistic here as well, which is that it's a similar pattern. 84% of women had experienced at least one form of sexual harassment in their lifetime, compared to 60% of men. This is the vast majority of people experiencing it. So I'm going to move us on to who are the perpetrators. Now, I find this is quite an interesting statistic. So of those who experienced it, 63% said the perpetrator was a man, 22% said the perpetrator was a woman. And in this, it's man or men, women or women. So it could be plural. Of the women experiencing sexual harassment, 10% said it was by a woman, 81% said it was by a man. Of the men experiencing it, 46% said it was by another man, and 35% said it was by a woman or women. So interesting. And obviously we've got the non-binary stats within there as well, if you want to dig a little deeper. We'll come on to some stuff about other protected characteristics shortly. The next question I wanted to introduce from the survey, this is still in the Government Equalities Office survey, is where this is happening. So 20% said at their workplace, so their general headquarters. 13% said when socializing with colleagues outside the workplace. Now, you may already know, but it can be a myth, that this still counts as work. If it's a work event, it's still a workplace. So it might be a client event, it might be a Christmas party. If it's a work event, it still counts. 9% said while visiting clients or customers. Now that's interesting because they are not within our organization. We can't give them training. We can't set expectations for them in the same way, but there are still things we can do. So that is something we'll come on to a little bit later. We need to think about this particularly for SAIM members and people who work in similar environments, because a lot of the work of ecologists and environmental managers is, of course, conducted on site. So let's dig a little bit more into these third-party harassment statistics. This time it's research from the TUC. 7% of women have reported sexual harassment from a third party at work. 13% if they were younger, so of young women aged 18, 20 to 24 said they'd been harassed by a third party. So I think we can see where some of that behaviour can be directed. Now, I'm going to take us back to a poll again, see if you have any insights on these questions. So here we are. On your screen, you should have what percentage of women experiencing sexual harassment experienced it remotely via emails, text, social media, Zoom, Teams, Slack, etc. What percentage of women experiencing sexual harassment reported an increase while working from home? And this was the pandemic study. This was a study done by the Rights of Women, a leading women's charity, and it was in 2021. While you have a think about that, I'm just going to read you some comments from that survey. One woman highlighted how working from home has enabled her harassers to further invade her privacy. Having to let colleagues into my bedroom via video meetings means I feel my privacy has been invaded and nowhere is safe. These men now have more ammunition to mock me with. Another woman spoke of her experience on Zoom. The director of the company uses Zoom to take screenshots of myself and other women, which he shares with colleagues, making derogatory statements and implying the photos look like we're doing sexual acts. And another woman spoke of the impact of working from home on her ability to report sexual harassment. The fact it's on Zoom and in front of others in a jokey manner makes it difficult to address. Okay, Sarah, what are our results from our participants today? Okay. So the first one, I think the majority was absolutely right on that. 45% of women experiencing sexual harassment experienced it remotely. But 23, so nearly a quarter, experienced an uplift while working from home. And this is interesting. There was a comment there around Zoom and lots of people online and everyone finding it funny or appearing to perhaps, but those one-on-ones as well. We work quite a lot with organizations that have different types of spaces people work in. And one that makes me think particularly of this is theatre and backstage, because in looking at a risk assessment, which is something we recommend and can help with, you don't want things to be not observed. It's actually a safer environment if people are there, as long as those people know how to behave. Okay, thank you for participating in those. I'm going to move us forward. A couple more slides. This one I think is particularly important. So more than 2/3 of disabled women reported having been sexually harassed at work. The same for LGBTQ people. 2/3 of these respondents didn't report it. That's much higher than the normal level. 37% of women from an ethnic minority background state race and gender as a reason for verbal abuse, so they face double discrimination. Now, there's something here that, again, this is from the TEC research. What they say is that it appeared to be linked to the sexualization of LGBT identities and the misconception that these identities solely focus on sexual activity. So people influenced by these stereotypes see being lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans as an invitation to make sexualized comments and ask inappropriate questions about someone's sexual life, especially if the individual is out. We think as well about intersectionality here. Again, from this research, structural racism, sexism, and discrimination means that for many Black, Asian, and minority ethnic women, work can be a place where discrimination is almost baked into their workplace experience, increasing the likelihood of sexual harassment. They're not only more likely to be unsafe at work, but they're less likely to have the power, financial resources, or help available. I'm not saying they don't, they're less likely. 1 in 8 BME women are in insecure jobs compared to 1 in 18 white men, showing the extent of their relative insecurity. So there's some really stark studies out there. Finally, I wanted to share one more with you, again from the TUC research, what the impact is. Now, measurable impacts here, 17% of victims looked for a new job. 41% said there were no consequences for their perpetrator. You can imagine what that might do for people feeling that they can report, feeling it's worth reporting. And in the workshops that we run with organisations, we go into what might stop people. We are humans. We didn't wake up on a Tuesday expecting this to happen to us and feeling we needed to become a champion, or believing that anyone would do anything about it if it's never been discussed. So the most common thing that people did was look for a new job. So you'll be losing good people over this if you're not making sure it won't happen. Okay, getting a little more specific now, the SIEM State of the Profession survey. Here are a couple of quotes from that. Female respondents reported not being taken seriously by contractors, having their advice identical to that of a male colleague ignored, and having questions addressed to more junior male colleagues when, as the project lead on the site, they should have been the one to answer the questions. Personally, that resonates with me and some of my career experience. There were also numerous examples of female respondents experiencing an inappropriate behaviour on construction sites with the use of belittling terms of address, wolf whistles, indecent gestures being the butt of jokes. So this survey was open to SIAM members and non-members in January and February of this year. So this is the most up-to-date of the stats we're talking about and very specific to this cohort. So there were over 1,000 respondents. 86% were SIAM members, 75% based in England, 93% based in the UK. And as we discussed before, the most commonly experienced, it was most commonly experienced on construction sites, with farm environments also being mentioned. The impacts are an uncomfortable working environment and, of course, the impact on mental health, mental well-being. That is not only important for individuals and how that might affect their life and their own progression, but Focal Point's own joint research with the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment in 2022 talked about the impact of banter that crosses the line. This is something we look at quite a lot in our workshops, and the knock-on effects of an uncomfortable environment. So over 700 people responded to this one. 60% said when they felt banter crossed the line, they put forward fewer ideas. 69% contributed less in meetings. 33% looked for a new job. So you can just imagine what that does for individual productivity, for teamwork and innovation. People are just trying to keep their heads below the parapet in a scenario where they feel unsafe. So finally on the stats, this is a graphic from the SIAM survey that shows workplace disadvantages experienced by gender. The green represents the number of, or the percentage of female respondents who tick this particular box. Blue is for the male. About 30% of respondents in total had experienced some of these disadvantages related to their gender. Across all 7, more females reported more disadvantage. And the highest reported disadvantage, counting both genders, was for inappropriate comments. So this is something that's happening in your sector. Microaggressions and hostilities from third parties, so over on the right, you can see is the second highest. And I think it's worth mentioning here that as much as these may not all have been of a sexual nature, their prevalence is still a warning sign that inappropriate behaviour was experienced by over 20% of women and also a small percentage of men. Culturally, if you have sexual discrimination, you are very likely to have sexual harassment and vice versa, because it's part of the same spectrum of inappropriate and unacceptable behaviour. And I think we saw from the other stats as well, generally there will be intersectionality across various protected characteristics. Another notable finding from this survey was that respect from others / peers was the lowest rated benefit from working in the sector. Okay, so that's the stats done. We're shortly going to come on to our panel. This is your checklist of things you should already have in place. So from October last year, the law required reasonable steps to be taken. I've mentioned risk assessments. Where do your people work? Who are they with? What events are coming up, etc. A clear and accessible policy, strong message from the top that there will not be tolerated, lots of role modelling at all levels, reporting mechanisms in place and people aware of them, a speak up culture created and supported. Now that's not something you can impose, I would argue. It's something that you need to create for yourselves by having discussions. When I go in and work with organisations, I'm not saying this is going to be your new culture. I'll say, what do you love about your culture? What would you like to change? How can we do that? How we work together to keep each other on track and make sure it's really positive for everyone. And particularly on training, so regular, not just one-off. And I was delighted last week to have a new client, and the main feedback was that this needs to happen for everybody and much more often. To be honest, these sessions, as much as this is a very serious and important topic having a big impact, they're very human. These are forward-looking training sessions. And we don't look at blame, we look at what feels good, what doesn't feel good, what would look better, and how to give each other gentle nudges and nip things in the bud to stop things escalating, as well as particular support for managers so they're confident to deal with it. So enough from me. I'm going to have a nice glass of water after I introduce the panel again. We have Tilly Tilbrook, Director of Integrated Ecological Solutions Limited, and Emma Hatchett, Head of Nature Services at WSP UK Limited. So I can see you both online. Welcome. Do feel free to unmute yourselves. I'm going to take us through about 4 questions and we'll alternate between the two of you. But to start with, just to say welcome, please introduce yourself as I ask you your first question. And I'll pass first to Tilly and then I will pass to Emma. So Tilly, welcome. Here's your first question. Could you describe to us your own experience and observations of sexual harassment in the profession? And how do you handle these situations? Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So I've been working as an ecologist for 23 years now. I've worked in local government, I've worked in consultancy, I've been seconded to places like DEFRA, I've worked at Natural England. So we've got a broad range of experiences in various different settings. 23 years ago when I started, the problem was more prevalent than it is now, and certainly not taken particularly seriously. It was certainly very common to turn up on site and experience sexual harassment from third parties in form of clients and labourers and that kind of thing. It was often perpetrated as well by management in those situations. You know, turning up and being young and female on site is never easy. The way that I handle it now compared with the way I would have handled it when I was more junior are 2 slightly different questions, I think. Now I am very comfortable with returning the awkward to sender, which is something I would always encourage my staff to do, which is that I have not made that situation awkward, they have, and I am well within my rights to call that out, and to, you know, make them equally uncomfortable by, you know, asking exactly what they meant by that and whether that's an appropriate thing to say at work. I do think that the one thing that everyone should be aware of is, you know, what is the escalation pathway in terms of who do I speak to when this happens to me? So I feel quite strongly that staff, and especially more junior staff, should understand who they can go to report it, who will be the person who will deal with that issue for them, whether that's their line manager, whether it's the site manager. And I think it's really critical that people do understand how to handle it and don't feel like they've got to deal with it on their own, because I think that's a very difficult thing to do, especially when you're quite junior.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Emma, I'll pass to you if you can introduce yourself and then just to remind you of the question, what's your own experience and observation and how do you handle these situations?
Hi, thanks, Kate. I am Emma Hatchett. I have been leading nature services at WSP for a couple of years, but all in all, in consultancy for about the same length as Tilly, 20 odd years. I've always worked in consultancy, but have ranged from smaller consultancies that are a bit more specialist to a couple of big engineering firms, which is where I am now. I agree, it has cleaned up its act a little bit, the construction industry over the last 20 years, and certainly less prevalent now. But I've experienced things where I've had people intruding into my social media and making friend requests to me, wishing me a happy birthday, all of those things very unwanted, and then asking me face to face in a social setting, not necessarily a social setting, but a break room, why I hadn't accepted friend requests, and that's really awkward to be faced with that kind of thing. And so you feel the pressure to say yes to that friend request. I know Facebook isn't necessarily the social media that people use anymore, but it's a similar thing with any social media. And I think it's important to, as Tilly said, make sure you know how to report those instances, how to deal with those by not keeping it to yourself, but to share that experience with others, because others will have experiences and will know the way of making sure something is done about those individuals and that experience that you've had. So whilst it may have cleaned up a little bit in terms of some of the dealings in the construction industry, it certainly hasn't all gone away. And I think each individual will have their own experiences, and they'll all be very different. But what makes people feel uncomfortable is also different. So we need to as managers, we need to respect where people feel uncomfortable and help them to find a way through that experience.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Still with you, Emma, what are the main hurdles in your view to preventing sexual harassment? What's getting in our way?
I think there's probably quite a lot of embarrassment, which is why we don't get the reporting. I think that people are perhaps embarrassed or maybe fearful, particularly if those people who are sexually harassing someone being a bit more senior than them. There may be some fear of what the repercussions might be that prevents people from reporting it. And there's also perhaps there's some tolerance there in terms of the banter that you spoke about earlier, and everybody finding it funny in a public setting, and therefore you feel embarrassed and you feel you can't really speak up. And I think there's probably lots of instances where there is inadequate training about what is appropriate and what is inappropriate behaviour, what you should feel comfortable about reporting and how to report things at the chain. So maybe you don't know the route to report things in the right way. And, perhaps you might talk to a friendly colleague about what's happened to you. And if they just brush it off, perhaps then you feel a bit silly, perhaps feeling uncomfortable in that situation. So all of those things, really, embarrassment, fear, maybe feeling a bit silly to report those things up, and that lack of training in some areas. That's what I'd say.
Thank you, Emma. Tilly, would you add anything in terms of the hurdles to prevention?
Yes, I think the other big one is that ecologists especially, we often work with third parties. So we're often sent onto site, you're often sent onto site alone, as in not with any of your colleagues, to go and meet people and work with them on site. And I think that can be very intimidating, and there can be a real feeling that those people are the client, and actually, you don't want to upset the client. They're the ones paying the bills, and that can be a real hurdle, I think. And people feel that they can't speak up about that either nothing will be done, or they don't know where to speak up about it, or that the power imbalance is such that this is just something that you have to put up with on construction sites or in sort of different environments. So I think that's a real problem. And I think just culturally, generally, there is sort of pressure to let the small stuff slide, and quite often people who are prone to sexually harassing people will be testing to see what the limit is, what is the thing that they can get away with, and if you let the small things slide and you don't report those and do anything about those, then they'll escalate, and they'll just see whether are you going to report it if it gets a bit worse. And then the people who are victims of this sort of feel that they're in a bit of a no-win situation because they didn't report it initially, and so it gives the perpetrator a bit of plausible deniability, like, oh, well, they never said there was a problem. And I think that can be a real issue as well.
Yeah, absolutely. This was coming up in some workshops that I was doing in the last few weeks, and particularly around that feeling of gaslighting that banter has, where it's like, what's only banter, as if it's your problem that you're not finding it funny, which is interesting, isn't it, when people are pushing that line. And the risks around humour often lying where that line is, but there are other types of humour, and that's what it's really good to bring out in some of these conversations within your own organisations. We do still want to be having a good time at work. So still with you, Tilly, for a second. What are your organisations, in this case, your organisation itself, doing to take reasonable steps? And what examples of good practice have you seen and can you share?
Yeah, so one of the things that I always do is before my staff go out on site or, are working in any kind of environment, especially where they're going to come in contact with third parties, it's not that it's less of an issue within the workplace. It's just that for us, there are far fewer people. So I kind of see everything that's going on. So it's much easier to nip anything in the bud that way because I'm not that far removed from everyone's day-to-day work. But the thing I always tell them is that if anything like that happens on site, they can respond in a way they feel is appropriate, and I will have their back every single time. So if that's saying something back which feels rude, that's fine. You can be rude right back at people that are being rude to you in that situation. If they don't feel comfortable, then it's my job to go and sort that out for them. So they need to report it to me so that I can go and solve that problem for them, and whatever that looks like, whether it looks like speaking to the site manager, whether it looks like, rearranging the team so that I get some kind of direct experience out there. I have been informed of things by my staff and have got up and been on site 2 hours away by 7:30 the next morning in order to talk to a site manager at the site briefing and have someone removed from working with my team. And the site manager was not pleased about that because they were short of machine drivers, and I gave him two choices, which were either you remove that person from working with my team or my entire team is leaving the site now. Because I don't think that I think you need to have a zero tolerance policy in place to this kind of stuff. Some of the best practice I've seen is where people have been really clear about what what is unacceptable behaviour, that they have a zero tolerance policy to that unacceptable behaviour, and then they follow through on that. And that follow through is probably the most important part of it, because it's very easy to sit there and say this is unacceptable behaviour, but actually when it comes down to it and something actually happens, what is practically being done. But I have seen people walked off site as a result of that kind of zero tolerance policy, and that's really it culturally needs to come from the top, I think.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. Emma, same question to you. What are you doing to take reasonable steps, and what examples of good practice can you share?
We have an outlet for reporting instances. It's a health and safety reporting primarily around RAMs for site work, but any type of reports that have happened whilst people have been at work in any workplace can be reported through that. And that goes all the way up to our upper levels of management and our health and safety leads within the business. They often follow up before I've even had a chance to follow up with our team to make sure that everyone is okay, and B, to then follow it up with action. So we make sure that all reports are followed up that come through that system. We've also got an independent employee assistance program that no one needs to share that with people in the business. If they need counselling, that is offered through that system, and they can talk to trained professionals rather than just managers. They can talk to trained professionals to get some help and support, and that all remains confidential unless they want to share the details of that with us. And then we obviously have policies around acceptable and unacceptable behaviours, and then we have processes for reporting those. And any reports of unacceptable behaviour within our business or external to our business teams are always investigated by independent people outside of the team that person works in, so that it's taken forward by HR and also senior members of the business. So we have lots of robust processes, but Tilly's right, everything has to be followed up, because you can't just brush things off, because you've got to sweat the small stuff to make sure that the bigger stuff doesn't become an issue. And I think all businesses should have those policies in place, and places where people can go, and a clear route that people can report issues through. that doesn't necessarily just involve their immediate team. With Tilly's business being a much smaller business, that's a bit different. But obviously, Tilly takes a very hands-on approach to managing all of those situations. With a larger business like ours, we have a way that it doesn't just go within team and people externally, so you can feel comfortable with reporting people within your team if needs be, because there's that independence to it. And I think business size makes a massive difference in terms of what you can and can't do. But having those policies and processes clearly laid out is the important piece that every business can do.
And I would just, can I add to that, Kate, which is just that I think, especially if you are in a smaller business, one of the things we've done is made sure we are a registered practice with CIEM, which opens us up to their employee assistance program, which is not something we could provide as a business, but it means that there are independent people that they can talk to. And so something we do is that all our staff, including any seasonal temporary contracts, we get them into CIEM membership as quickly as we can so that they have access to that, and it's someone independent to talk to, which I think, as Emma has mentioned, is really important, and also access to those counselling sessions that comes through that CIEM programme. So I do think even if you're a small company, there are things that you can be doing to bring that level of independence in, and that you should be doing, frankly, because at the end of the day, it's very hard to report something to your manager if they're the person that's controlling whether you have a job or not. And you need to have that level of independence available to your staff.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a really good recommendation. And just reflecting in some of the culture work that we do, this is where you have to actively build messages into your culture, isn't it? Because we don't want people gossiping about behaviour. It doesn't help. How are you going to land these messages of what's the right way to respond unless you're proactively pushing those messages out so people are really, really clear? So that's great to hear that happening. Thank you very much. So I'm going to come back to Emma for a second with our fourth question, which is, what more does the profession need to do, and what more do individual organisations need to be doing?
I think we've covered it a little bit in some of the other answers to some of the questions. Training for not only what to do when or if you're unfortunately subject to this kind of harassment, but recognition of what sexual harassment is, equipping individuals to speak out about it, and also speaking out for other people that might not feel confident to bring that up, because we all need supporters, don't we? We just, to do our roles in whichever way you look at it, we all need that support from our colleagues and our friends to make the job easier. And so having that support and being able to support other people is really important. And we've got to do that to stamp out those inappropriate behaviours. So I think the key really is training in not only the ways of reporting, and also what's appropriate and not appropriate in terms of behaviours, but also training in how you recognise what that might be and how you might support your colleagues in dealing with those situations.
Lovely, thank you. And back to you, Tilly, finally. What more do you think the profession should be doing? You could also talk about us as individuals.
Yeah, so I think Emma's covered really what organisations need to be doing. But one of the key things is, what should people be doing to be allies in this situation? And men especially, I think, have a very big part to play in this, because it's not enough to not sexually harass people. That's good, but that's the lowest possible bar, really, of common sort of human decent behaviour. The problem with this, and the reason why this is such an issue, is it's baked into society and it's culturally been acceptable for a very long time. And so one of the things that I think you can do is, if you are in a position of strength and a position of privilege, whatever that looks like, is to actually call these things out when they happen in a setting that is not necessarily at work. Because sort of people who do this at work are the sort of people who send that slightly off-color meme to the group chat, or who make that joke in the pub that just isn't, and you might kind of not laugh at it, but you're also not saying anything. And they are the people that need to hear it from other men, or indeed if you are a woman in a position to speak up about it, to say, actually, that's really not okay. That's not funny. And and actually don't do that. Don't bring that into this situation, because those people who are sort of harassing people they're not only doing it in a work situation. In fact, the work situation is the result of having got away with it in situations where it doesn't threaten things like their livelihood, and in having tested the water elsewhere and been like, well, you know what, no one's called me out on that, so actually I probably am in the right. That's probably okay, actually. And really, I think one of the most important things we can do is call out those behaviours early on, and in settings where it's happening with sort of much fewer power imbalances. And you know what, that's really awkward and it's really uncomfortable. But I think it's really important for people to do. And I think, especially if you are a man who's thinking, well, this is, these things are terrible, I guarantee you have heard someone make a bit of an off-color joke and you've ignored it. And those are the things that we shouldn't be ignoring.
Absolutely. I think it chimes with the point. One of the reasons people don't speak up when they're personally offended is because everyone else seems to be fine with it. And that can be sort of that bystander effect of no one is saying anything. So if you have that privilege of power, I think that's great, just to say, step up and say that's not acceptable. And of course, having these conversations up front before it happens really helps, and people find it really helpful to do that. The world has changed a lot in the last, well, however many years since I've been at work, since about 2000. It's changed hugely around us, so it can be difficult to get on the same page. We're quite a diverse organisation. We tend to work in more diverse organisations now in terms of age, gender, and everything else. So it can be really useful to use work to say what is acceptable these days, and to hear advice from other people in that diverse group to tell you, well, this I find better than this. That has been some of the most useful stuff I've seen coming out of the workshops we lead, is that really helpful information. And not least for people with neurodivergence, that means that social rules are difficult. So sometimes my most engaged people are those who normally would not be wanting to sit through a sort of 20-minute group discussion, but find it so helpful to know what these rules really are and have them spelt out. Well, thank you so much to both of you. We've got some questions starting to come in, so I will encourage the participants here, please, to ask some more questions here. As I said, we'll get through what we can in this time. I'm also going to ask you to have a think about some of the actions you might take yourselves. And while I just invite those questions, I'm going to just do a little reflection. Thank you again to Emma and Tilly for your brilliant responses, some really helpful practical stuff there. What my sum up would be on everyone's responsibility is to reflect on your own behaviour. When we run these workshops, we don't rake back over the past, but we do have a think about it. And we do think about times when we may have inadvertently or in a jokey way overstepped the mark, and think what would be a better way to be. And equally, all of us should be speaking up if we see a behaviour that crosses the line. We shouldn't just wait for it to be something that affects us personally. So how do we equip team members to deal with the behaviour when they see it? The main thing we ask people to do is recognise what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable behaviour at work, and be clear in your own mind what to do about that. So teams and individuals need to know they've got the backing of the managers. I think that came across really clearly from Tilly and Emma. So if they come back, they've got their back covered. Think about whether your managers would know how to handle a concern if it was raised with them. Would they know what to say and do? If they ignore it, or if they respond disproportionately, it can have a very damaging effect. So it can be leading to low trust, escalation of behaviour, good people leave. And acting quickly is really important. We had a client about 18 months ago who let a situation rumble on, just hoping it would resolve itself. But it became much more complicated, so much worse for everyone, sent some terrible messages about whether things are dealt with when they should be, and did result in a good person leaving, which didn't need to be the outcome. So there are lots of risks there, not least on, we've talked about productivity, we've talked about recruitment and retention. You don't want this stuff on Glassdoor. There's all kinds of things that can impact not just on the individuals, though that in itself is not unimportant. So I'm going to move us on to questions. I can see one has come up here. The first question that's come in, it said, where can you report sexual harassment to if HR and CEOs are the perpetrators of the harassments? That's a really important question. I was reading an article recently on the separation that is needed, particularly between the chief exec and HR for this particular reason, because they ought to be a mirror of, to hold up against them and not be in too close collusion. But the other element of who should be involved is the board or the owner. Now, of course, that could be the CEOs as well. So it does create a difficult situation. Tilly mentioned if you're a small organisation, perhaps where this might be the case, then using the employee assistance programme from SAIM might be a route to getting reporting in. But I'd like to invite Tilly and Emma to share their wisdom. What would you say in response to that question? First to Tilly, please.
So I would say if you are in a larger organisation, I would speak to a senior manager that is not in either, is not the CEO, is not HR, someone that you trust to ask them what they think, how they think you should go about reporting it, how they can back you up. And be really clear about what you're looking for from them. So, you're not necessarily looking for them to resolve it. What you're looking for is someone to provide you with the support to make that report to the right person, and who will have your back during that process. If you're in a smaller organisation, I think it becomes exponentially more difficult, and there's no way around that, because there may be a very limited number of people you can speak to. If there is another senior manager, I would speak to them, but I would also encourage you to talk to colleagues and express discomfort collectively. It is much more difficult to ignore a group of people, and to push back against a group of people than it is an individual. And I think also, especially if they are a registered practice, I would contact CIM and ask for their support in that as well.
Lovely, thank you. Emma, that seems pretty exhaustive to me, but do you have anything you'd want to add?
I think if you just one thing, it is what Tilly says is absolutely the advice that I would give as well. But I wonder if you are an individual, perhaps taking a friendly colleague in just as a support, even if they're not going to say anything in the meeting, just somebody who's a friendly face that can help you to just have that kind of reassuring smile, which I think helps a lot when you've got that reassuring smile and you're trying to deliver a difficult message. So, and that's only in that small organisation, but I'd absolutely support going to another leader in a bigger organisation if that's something that's an option.
And I would also say document everything. Document
Yes.
everything in writing with dates and times as it happens. It's really easy to think you'll remember everything, but actually if you've got it all written down, that is much more powerful.
Yes, absolutely. That's key, I think.
And to Emma's point, these people may be really powerful in your life and in your organisation, but there's always someone else more powerful somewhere, even if it's their own clients or somebody they care what their view is. So be aware of where your allies might lie. Lovely. I can't see any more questions at the minute, so I'm going to move us forward. I wanted to share with you that there is a discount for SAIM members on focal point services to help prevent sexual harassment. So do feel free to take a photograph of or link straight through to the QR code here. It's not time limited. This is something that will need to continue to be tackled ongoing. We hope that society is starting to get better at this stuff, but without our efforts, it clearly won't. So do have a look at that and see if that looks interesting to you. All of our sessions at Focal Point end with actions for ourselves. So it would be absolutely great if you could use the chat function just to share anonymously, if you like, an action you might take away yourself in order to move this issue forward and help your managers feel more prepared and put your organisation in a position where it has a preventative approach to sexual harassment. If you're happy to do that, that would be lovely. I'll call a couple out if I see them come in. In the meantime, I'm going to quickly move a slide along to say thank you so much for joining us today, and particular thank you to Tilly and Emma for your brilliant advice and sharing your experience. That's absolutely wonderful to hear. I continue to learn every time we engage with this topic, and I'm heartened to hear all the stories of what you're doing on the ground. Thank you to Tasaim for hosting today. With the pack, you'll get some more information on Focal Point, and I'll just flick us back up to the QR code in case that is interesting. Thank you very much. I'm just looking to see if we have any actions coming through, if anyone's brave enough to say something they might personally do or encourage their organisation to do on the back of what they've heard about today. Oh, thank you very much. We have one here to say has made you feel more empowered to speak up on this, especially the microaggressions to management. And thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. And I must say that as much as this is a very serious topic that has huge impact, it's also a really human one. And one of the things I love about these workshops is that people are usually told they have to come to a mandatory workshop. They all look a bit dismal. People come in expecting the worst and expecting to be told off. And so quickly we get to a point where we're not doing that. We're looking to the future and looking at how we can keep the things we want in our culture and build out from there to make us really successful organisations with really thriving people in them. So I really hope you find the same from engaging with this, albeit unpleasant topic. Thank you very much. I think I will give us all 3 minutes back of our lives. Everyone can go and make a cup of tea before your 1 o'clock. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Kate.
Yes.